Hi everyone, welcome back for week 3 of Introduction to Lithic Analysis. As always, I'm Lauren, your instructor for this course, so let's get started. Before we get into the material for this week, I wanted to include a couple of review slides. So you should recognize this slide from last week, since we're focusing on analysis this week. Being able to identify the different parts of cores and flakes is really important, as you'll rely on this throughout any lab work that you do. So just as a review, here are the parts of a core: the napping platform or striking platform, the napping surface, which is the area where flakes are removed from, scars, which are any previous flake removals, the bulb negative, the edge, which is the area between the platform and the napping surface, and the cortex, which is the natural surface of the raw material. Additionally, here are the parts of a flake. Remember that the dorsal face is the exterior side or the back of the flake, and the ventral face is the interior side or the belly of the flake. The proximal end refers to the end of the striking platform and can be identified by the butt of the flake as well as the bulb if it's present. And the distal end refers to the end where the flake terminates and can be identified by the tapering out of this termination. Anything between the two of the proximal and distal portions is referred to as the medial portion. So if you have a flake fragment, you would describe it either as a distal fragment, a proximal fragment, or a medial fragment, depending on which part of the flake it comes from. Additionally, there's also the scars and ridges, which you can see on the drawing here. Other important parts to identify on flakes include the bulb, ripples, the edge, and any potential scars that may be present on the dorsal face. And now let's get into the topic of this week, which is macroscopic analysis. In terms of scientific analysis, there are two types of data: qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative data focuses on qualities or observable characteristics, while quantitative data revolves around numbers. In lithic analysis, both are important. Qualitative data in this sense is the recordation of attributes and characteristics of artifacts based on visual analysis, and includes interpreting many of the parts that we've discussed before, as well as some that we're going to get into shortly. Quantitative data is taking this qualitative data and interpreting it through a numerical lens so that we can interpret it in other ways, such as relative frequencies, averages, and so on. So for now, we're going over qualitative data and how to interpret this in different types of lithic artifacts. Cores, as we know, are objective pieces and are used as sources of raw material when flint knapping to produce a flake. In archaeological contexts, it's important to remember that cores are highly variable and their morphology is representative of the stage at which they were discarded. Some cores are deposited after being highly exhausted, while others have been expended very little, and so the state of the core really depends on the context in which it was deposited in. Further, when interpreted, cores can be considered either formalized or informal. And what this indicates is the level of prior preparations that went into the core before its use for flake extraction. Formalized cores undergo a series of preparations, sometimes in stages, to allow for maximized cutting edge of flake products, as well as an increased uniformity when detaching pieces with more predictable removal patterns. And informal cores undergo no preparation and are essentially raw material that has been selected for immediate knapping without any shaping prior to flake removal. Examples of these two different types are Levallois and Oldowan cores, with Levallois being formalized and Oldowan being informal. When analyzing any artifact, really, one of the key things to record are the dimensions, in the sense length, width, thickness, and weight. And standard conventions for this are to record the dimensions of measurement in millimeters and grams. In measuring a core, the length is generally going to be the longest measurement perpendicular to the striking platform and parallel to flake removals. So if you have the core here, your length measurement would be the longest point that is perpendicular to the striking platform and parallel to the flake removals. This can be a little bit confusing when looking at a core that has removals from multiple directions and has multiple striking platforms. This can also lead to problems in comparisons due to lack of uniformity across cores. So to address these complications, some scholars, including Andrzejewski, use another measurement to analyze and compare core measurements. This is by taking the maximum linear dimension, which is the greatest surface area of the core, and multiplying it by its weight. This provides a uniform measure of size for all cores, which allows for cross comparison without any errors, as opposed to utilizing the length. In addition to being formalized or informal, cores can also be classified as unidirectional or multidirectional. Unidirectional cores have a single flat surface area which serves as the striking platform, removing roughly parallel flakes with each strike. This results in flake scars that run parallel to one another, leaving behind a pronounced ridge on the core, indicating where the next flake should follow. The most common type of unidirectional cores would be for the production of blades or bladelets, such as is shown in this drawing here. You can see on the right side is the unidirectional core with flake scars running parallel to one another. And multidirectional cores are characterized by somewhat randomized flake removal coming from more than one direction and using more than one striking platform. Examples of this type of reduction strategy include Levallois, radial, and bipolar cores, which you can see an example here on the drawing on the left side. That's a multidirectional core. You can see the flake scars are coming from varying different directions. There are also a couple of other things that you should consider when analyzing cores. One being that raw material also has an impact on the end product, largely varying by the size and shape of the objective piece. And bipolar cores are often hard to interpret as well because they are generally amorphous in shape and are reminiscent of angular shatter. Bipolar cores are often highly exhausted as well, partially contributing to this amorphous shape. Briefly mentioned before, Levallois cores are present in the Middle Paleolithic Mousterian. They're also highly specialized in reduction strategy, and so I thought I would talk about these a little bit more in depth. Specifically, there are two different Levallois strategies referred to as lineal and recurrent reduction. Lineal reduction was originally defined by Boards, also known as the traditional Levallois technique. This reduction strategy is designed to remove a single pre-shaped flake from the center of a prepared core surface. In order to achieve this, the core is shaped so that there is a continuous striking platform around the entire perimeter of the upper surface. Once the desired flake is removed, the core must be reshaped around the entire perimeter again in order to remove the flake. An example is shown here in this illustration. This is the lineal reduction strategy for Levallois. The more strategic of the two is the recurrent reduction method. This allows for the removal of multiple flakes from the prepared core surface rather than just a single flake before the core requires reshaping. This type of strategy generally has a centripetal removal pattern, which you can see in this drawing here, which exhibits the centripetal removal of flakes from the surface prior to reshaping the core. Moving on to flakes, which are my favorite. There are a number of things that should be recorded during the analysis of lithic flakes, including the dimensions, which include length, width, thickness, and weight, as I mentioned before, recorded in millimeters and grams, as well as the raw material type, which this should also be recorded for cores. I just haven't mentioned it. Other features include taphonomic influences, the edge length of the flake, which is the extent of the sharp edge around the perimeter of the flake, characteristics of the striking platform, which we'll get into shortly, the presence of any potential napping accidents, and characteristics found by looking at the ventral and dorsal faces, as well as the profile sections of the artifact. This is where it might get a little bit confusing, so bear with me, and if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out. But we're going to be starting from the bottom, looking at the butt of the flake or the striking platform. So there are a few features to identify, the first being the impact point, which is the exact point where the hammer hits the core. This should be preserved on the striking platform and is generally the area from which the bulb emanates. There are several different types of impact points addressed here on this slide. They are defined by facets, which are a way to measure the degree of striking platform preparedness. Shown in the illustration, non-faceted indicates no preparation by the presence of cortex, whereas unifaceted indicates a single removal, and bifaceted indicates two, and multifaceted means more than two. In regard to striking platform, in addition to the stage of preparation or how many facets there are, it's also common to indicate if this strike was centered or decentered, meaning that if it's centered, it would appear in the middle of the flake, whereas if it were decentered, it would be off to the side. And so there are several different classifications: centered non-faceted, centered unifaceted, centered bifaceted, decentered non-faceted, decentered unifaceted, and decentered bifaceted. In addition to recording the direction, which would be centered versus decentered, it's also important to indicate how many facets there are, which would indicate the level of preparation or the stage in reduction for the flake removal. So you can have, as I mentioned previously, non-faceted, which would indicate a fully cortical striking platform, unifaceted, which would indicate a singular facet or one scar, and bifaceted would indicate two scars, and multifaceted indicates more than two scars. Another important feature of the striking platform to record is the extent of cortex preserved on the butt, if it's present, which indicates more about the level of preparation as well as the stage of reduction. This can be defined as non-cortical, cortical, non-cortical dominant over cortical, or cortical dominant over non-cortical. I know that sounds really confusing, but it's pretty simplistic and self-explanatory. So non-cortical, also and cortical, is 0% of the cortex is preserved, whereas cortical indicates fully cortical, 100% cortex. Non-cortical dominant over cortical is also referred to as NCDC, which indicates that less than half of the butt is covered by cortex. And then as opposed to that, there is CDNC, which is cortical dominant over non-cortical, which indicates that more than half of the butt is covered by cortex. The particular type of striking platform is important to record as well. There are three main types shown here on this slide. This is relevant in determining, in some instances, what type of hammer was used to remove the flake. And so can be indicative of the particular type of technology or the reduction strategy being used. Platform is the most common type, also called plane. It presents as thick and wide and is usually associated with hard hammer and direct percussion methods. The other type is lineal. It refers to platforms that are elongated and thin, and these are often representative of soft hammer percussion techniques. And then the final type is punctiform. These types have a very small pinpointed platform and usually indicate soft hammer use or indirect percussion methods. The shape of the striking platform should be recorded as well based on the morphology. So the morphology of the striking platform just refers to the overall shape of the butt, which can be described as rectilinear, which is relatively just straight and rectangular. It can also be convex, which describes a butt that kind of juts outward, or concave, which is a butt that is kind of a bowl-shaped. Uniangular, which would be slightly like convex, but rather than rounded, it would be two separate angulars jutting together at the point. Or sinuous, which indicates a changing of angle or curvature throughout the overall extent of the butt. Also important to record are napping accidents. We talked about these a little bit last week, still very relevant for this week's lecture, so we're going to go over them again. When analyzing flakes, it's important to record any visible napping accidents that are present. So the different types are plunging, which is produced by an excess of force rolling back towards the core and removing more of the extent of the distal end. It's also known as an overshot flake. Other types include step or hinge fractures, which is when not enough force is applied or the napping surface lacks appropriate convexities. It's basically an abrupt termination, and the only difference between the two is that a step fracture ends with an abrupt termination with a straight distal end, whereas a hinge fracture ends with an abrupt termination with a rounded distal end. So it's kind of like it comes to a lip at a hinge, and it just, for a step, it planes off as like a step. There's also serrae fractures, which are produced by an excess of force that breaks the flake in half. This is also known as a split fracture, and not necessarily a napping accident on the flake itself, but indicative of napping accidents during previous removals in the napping process are step scars, which would be flake scars preserved on the dorsal flake, which reflect step flakes from previous removals. Also relevant are sections, which are the profile views of the flake. This helps to understand the geometry of the core from which the flake was produced. So transversal sections, as you can see based on the images on this slide, are running across the width of the flake from point A to point B in the diagram on the left, which is the profile view from the top angle. And a sagittal section refers to the view across the length of the flake from the side angle. Aside from the striking platform, analysis of both the ventral and dorsal faces should also be performed. So when looking at the ventral face, the two main characteristics you'll be looking for are the bulb and the overall shape of the ventral side. Also, for good lab etiquette, lithic flakes should be labeled on the ventral face above the bulb toward the distal end, as to avoid preventing detailed analysis of the dorsal face, since more information is often gained from the dorsal side. And I'd also like to point out, because I haven't mentioned it before, during lithic analysis, there are two conventions for analyzing flakes based on orientation. In Europe, in Eurasia as a whole, the general convention is to orient the flake with the proximal end down, whereas it's the opposite in North American contexts. I learned my analysis techniques in Europe, so I just tend to follow along with the Eurasian convention, which is to orient the flake with the proximal end down, so the butt is facing down and the distal end is up here, which would be the opposite of how it was extracted from the core. Also, in terms of bulb morphology, this is just related to the convexity of the ventral side next to the striking platform. The bulb can either be marked, diffuse, or fractured. And when it's marked, the bulb is very blatant. It's obvious. You can clearly see it developing across the proximal side of the ventral face. And this is generally produced by hard blows. Diffuse bulbs are when the convexity of the bulb is not very pronounced, so it's a little bit more hard to see. This is common in less isotropic materials and as well from soft hammer blows. So this can be indicative of use of a soft hammer during production. And fractured is just to indicate an incomplete bulb. So those are the three main types. In addition, the shapes, as we discussed previously, it's the same with the striking platform morphology. You can have either convex, concave, rectilinear, uniangular, then there are a couple others, irregular and others. These are just for morphologies that don't fall into the aforementioned types. When looking at the dorsal face, you should take note of the dorsal cortex, as well as any previous flake scars that are present. And as you can see, as I mentioned before, when analyzing flakes, the Eurasia convention is to orient the flake with the butt down and the distal end pointing upwards. So the flake here is in that orientation. Now, in terms of dorsal cortex, this is recorded in the same way that cortex on the striking platform is recorded, being cortical, non-cortical, non-cortical dominant over cortical, or cortical dominant over non-cortical. And the number of extractions indicates the estimate of the number of previous flake scars preserved on the dorsal flake. A note here, it is always best to be conservative and count only the clear scars. Small scars on the proximal end of the flake towards the butt are usually not counted because usually they correspond to preparation of the core prior to flake removal. So in this instance, you're only counting the larger scars. For example, on this flake here, we see 2 previous flake removals. When recording flake scars, interpretation of directionality can also provide a lot of information regarding the reduction sequence and material use, such as the exhaustion of the core. So in scar direction, the directionality of previous removals is preserved on the dorsal face. It informs about core rotation often. The flake is oriented with the butt, as I mentioned before, proximal end down, and the termination at the distal end. And there are several ways to classify the scar directions as indicated by this little drawing here. So we have oblique proximal right, longitudinal proximal, oblique proximal left, transversal left, oblique distal left, longitudinal distal, and oblique distal right. And so when you're recording the flake scars, you would just have the flake oriented with the butt side down, and then based on where the flake scars originate, you can tell whether it's transversal left or oblique distal right or longitudinal proximal, and so on and so forth. For all types of lithic artifacts, cores included, taphonomic features should be addressed as well. These include things that may alter the appearance of the artifact that are not intentional and not related to the production of the artifact. And there are several things to look out for, the first being pseudo-retouch. Pseudo-retouch mimics retouch, but is a natural occurrence due to either use wear or post-depositional factors, such as alterations to the edge that are not intentional, related to deposition, such as trampling, or just other forms of taphonomic influence. The other patina is, as indicated by this image here, is changes to the surface of the artifact related to the effects of weathering, and this often presents as discolored areas or areas of bleached surfaces. Diagenesis also is frequent. This is just changes to the surface caused by water-rock interactions and microbial activity and compaction after deposition. Another form of taphonomic influence that should be watched for is roundedness, which are changes to the edge angle related to the effects of weathering, generally abrasion produced by rolling, often in stream beds. The level of roundedness is indicated by a number starting with 1. This starts at 1 rather than 0 because of potential computational problems when using databases. So generally 1 would indicate no rounding, 2 is slight rounding, 3 is moderate rounding, and 4 is heavy rounding. And then another common type of taphonomic alteration is thermal alteration or fire effectiveness. And this is changes to the surface related to the effects of heat or the application of fire. This can be either intentional or unintentional, but regardless, the characteristics are the same. And the characteristics include pits or cupules, also referred to sometimes as pot lids, shown in the image on the right. And other impacts include cracks or discolorations as shown in the other image. Generally, it would show up as like a gray, like a milky gray for flint. And both of these are flint material, but I just chose these. It's much easier to identify fire effectiveness on flint as opposed to other materials. So just keep that in mind. Okay, retouched tools, they're a little bit more complicated. In addition to recording their dimensions, raw material type, and taphonomic features, there are several other characteristics to record here indicated by this table, which are significantly different than those of flakes. And these different features include delineation, mode complement, amplitude, direction, morphology, orientation, and location. This seems like a lot, but we're going to break it down and I'll give you some examples so that it's hopefully easier to understand. So here, in this sense, delineation refers to the border of the retouch. It can be considered continuous or regular throughout. Denticulated refers to a series of notches, and then notched is just a singular notch. Mode refers to the extent of the retouch, which is also indicated in a different way by amplitude. Mode refers specifically to the extent of the retouch when viewing from the transversal section. Simple is the most common, with abrupt being used to indicate retouch that has a very abrupt edge angle, and plane is used to describe retouch that is more elongated across the surface area. Amplitude indicates the depth of the retouch onto the surface of the flake, reflecting how intrusive the retouch is. It can be marginal or shallow, or it can be deep, which is very extensive. Mode complement refers to the overall morphology of the retouched flake scars. Normal retouch is the most common, with laminar being elongated scars that often run parallel to one another, and scalariform is a series of retouched scars that are imposed on one another. Direction here refers to the area on which the retouch is present on either the dorsal or the ventral face. Direct indicates that the retouch is on the dorsal face, whereas inverse indicates that it's on the ventral face. Alternating indicates that it's present on both faces in alternating places. So if you have a retouch here on the dorsal face, then on the ventral face retouch would be here, would be considered alternating. And bifacial indicates a rather continuous presence of retouch on both faces. Orientation indicates the point on the piece where the retouch takes place, such as lateral or along the side, or transversal, which would indicate retouching at the end portions. In addition to orientation, more precise locations should be given as well, indicating where exactly the retouch is presented, such as on the left, right, proximal, distal, etc., etc. Morphology reflects the overall shape of the retouch. Much like flakes, it can be concave, convex, straight, or sinuous, which indicates change in direction or shape. And finally, with retouched tools, you'll want to classify them in some way by attributing them either generally or more specifically to a tool type. Some of these tools would be side scrapers, end scrapers, denticulates, notches, burins, projectile points, and so on and so forth. So after assessing all other aforementioned characteristics, it should be pretty apparent which category your tool may fall under. Now, just briefly, I'm going to touch on how the data is recorded. In my experience, I usually utilize a paper form for the initial analysis. Following this, I utilize or create a database for the storage of the data and for further manipulation. If you're making your own database, Excel is very straightforward and easy to work with, and it also allows for data visualization with the use of the pivot table feature to create graphs and tables, which corresponds with the third thing on this slide, which is visualizing your data. So that's all for this week. I know we're breezing through everything, but because this course is so short, only 6 weeks, unfortunately, in order to cover all of the foundational material, we need to go through it quickly. I'd like to remind you again, if you have any questions, I encourage you to please reach out to me, as well as open potential discussions with some of your classmates. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Next week, we'll take a look at the Paleolithic archaeological record through stone tool technologies. We'll be talking about the lower Paleolithic through the upper Paleolithic, and also touching a little bit on the Mesolithic and Neolithic. So thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to continuing this course.